I'm someone who tells stories, and today, I'd like to share a few personal stories that revolve around what I often call the danger of the single story. I was raised on a university campus in the eastern part of Nigeria. My mother claims I began reading at age 2, though I believe it was more likely around 4. Either way, I was an early reader. The books I read were mainly British and American children's books, and early on, I started writing too. At around 7, I began creating my own stories, handwritten in pencil, illustrated in crayon, handed them to my poor mother to read. Naturally, I mimicked what I read. All the characters in my stories had white skin and blue eyes. They played in the snow, munched on apples, laughter, and were always chatting about the weather, marveling at the sunshine. Laughter. This was in Nigeria, where I had never seen snow, where mangoes not apples were common, and weather wasn't something we ever discussed, since it rarely changed. My characters also sipped ginger beer, simply because the characters in the books I loved didn't even know what ginger beer was. Laughter. And for years afterward, I longed to try it. What this tells us is just how impressionable, how susceptible we are, especially as children, to the power of stories. Because all the stories I consumed featured foreign characters, I started to believe that literature had to revolve around outsiders, people, and things I couldn't relate to. Everything shifted when I found African writers. There weren't many accessible at the time, but authors like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Lay sparked a turning point in how I viewed storytelling. It dawned on me that people who looked like me, girls with chocolate-colored skin and hair that wouldn't form ponytails, could also exist within the pages of books. I started writing about things I knew. I still cherish those Western books. They sparked my imagination and opened up new worlds, but their unintended impact was that I didn't realize people like me could be found in literature. Discovering African authors rescued me from that narrow vision, what I now call the single story of what books could be. I come from a typical middle-class Nigerian background. My father was a professor, my mother an administrator, and like most families in our social class, we had domestic help, young people, who usually came from nearby rural villages. The year I turned 8, we had a new houseboy named Fide. The only thing my mother ever mentioned about him was that his family was very poor. She'd send them our old clothes, yams, rice. If I didn't finish my food, my mother would remind me, "Finish it, there are people like Fide's family who have nothing." So I felt deep sympathy for them. Then one Saturday, we visited his village. His mother proudly showed us a beautifully crafted basket his brother had made from dyed raffia. I was surprised. It had never crossed my mind that someone in family could actually create something beautiful. All I had heard about them was how poor they were. Their poverty had become their entire identity in my mind. A single story. Years later, I recalled this when I moved to the US for university. At 19, my American roommate was bewildered by me. She asked how I spoke English so fluently. She was confused when I explained that English was Nigeria's official language. She wanted to hear my tribal music, and was clearly let down when I played her a Mariah Carey tape. Laughter. She also assumed I couldn't cook or use a stove. What stunned me most was that she had already felt pity for me before we even met. Her view of Afrikaans was steeped in a single narrative, one of catastrophe. In her version, there was no room for complexity, no space for similarity, no possibility of a shared humanity. Before coming to the US, I didn't even consciously see myself as African, but in America, I was often cast into that role. People would turn to me for insight on the entire continent. Even though I'd never been to places like Namibia, still, I came to embrace that identity. Though I still find it irritating when Africa is referred to as a country, like on a recent Virgin Airlines flight from Lagos, where the announcement said they did charity work in India, Africa, and other countries. Laughter. After spending years in the US, I began to understand where my roommate's ideas came from. Had I grown up elsewhere and learned about Africa only through popular media, I'd likely view it the same way, as a place of wild animals, tragic poverty, and helpless people needing rescue. It reminded me of how I used to see Fide's family. This single story of Africa, deeply rooted in Western literature, has a long history. Take John Locke, a 16th century English merchant. After visiting West Africa, he described its people as beasts with no houses, and even claimed they had eyes and mouths in their breasts. Every time I read that, I laugh, but it's also a powerful example of imaginative distortion. His writing was part of a long tradition, portraying sub-Saharan Africa as a place of difference, darkness, and inferiority. Or, as poet Rudyard Kipling once put it, Africans were seen as half devil, half child. My American roommate had grown up with versions of that story all her life. So had a professor who once criticized my novel for not being authentically African, because my characters were middle class, drove cars, and weren't starving. But I've made the same mistake. Years ago, I visited Mexico. During a tense immigration debate in the U.S., Mexicans were being portrayed one-dimensionally, as border crossers, criminals, burdens, and on my first day in Guadalajara, watching people go about their daily lives, I was startled, then ashamed. I had unconsciously absorbed the media's version of who Mexicans were. A single story. The danger of the single story is this: it reduces people to one thing, again and again, until that one thing becomes all they are, and power plays a crucial role in Igbo. There's a word, nkeli. It loosely means to be greater than another. Power determines who tells the story, how it's told, and how many versions get to exist. The Palestinian poet Mourad Barghouti once said that if you want to take away someone's voice, start their story with secondly. If you begin with Native Americans shooting arrows, and not with settlers arriving, the story changes. If you begin with failed African states, rather than colonization, the story is different. A student once told me it was sad that Nigerian men were violent, referring to a character in my book. I told him I'd just read American Psycho. Laughter. And it was such a shame young American men were all serial killers. Laughter. Applause. I wasn't being capricious, it's just that I had read many stories about America. Not one story. And so, when I hear people say authors need tragic childhoods to write, I laugh because I had a joyful one, full of love and books. But the first also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps, a cousin who passed away due to lack of health care, a friend who died in a plane crash because our fire trucks had no water. I experienced military regimes that neglected education, causing salary delays and food shortages. Yet, if you only tell these stories, you erase all the others that made me who I am. The problem with stereotypes isn't that they're false, it's that they're incomplete. Yes, Africa has its tragedies, but there are countless stories beyond the catastrophized stories. Just as important to tell. To really engage with any place or person, you must hear all of their stories. Otherwise, the single story steals their dignity, silences complexity, and blocks empathy. So, imagine if before I visited Mexico, I'd heard both sides of the immigration debate. Imagine if my mother had said that Fide's family was poor and skilled. Imagine if African media could share our diverse stories with the world. Imagine if my roommate knew about Mutorba Kari, my Nigerian publisher who left a bank job to start a publishing house because he believed if literature were affordable and available, people would read. Or if she knew about Funmi Ayanda, the fearless TV host who tells the stories many choose to ignore. Or about the Lagos hospital where a heart surgery was just performed. Or the Nigerian musicians blending English, Pidgin, and influences from Jay-Z to Fela. Or the lawyer challenging outdated laws. Or the woman selling hair extensions after braiding hair for years. Or the countless Nigerians who start businesses, fail, and try again. Every visit home, I'm both frustrated by broken systems and deeply moved by the people's resilience. I teach writing workshops in Lagos. The demand is overwhelming. People want to write, to tell their stories. That's why my publisher and I launched Farafina Trust, an initiative to build and refurbish libraries, distribute books to underserved schools, and run storytelling workshops across Nigeria. Because stories matter. They've been used to oppress, but they can also empower, restore, and heal. As Alice Walker once said about her Southern relatives rediscovering their heritage through a book, they sat around, listening to me read, and a kind of paradise was regained. So here's my final thought. When we reject the single story, when we truly understand that no place or person has just one story, we reclaim that paradise. Thank you.